This kind of greed for power, this straightforward abuse of the law that enabled it during the Bush administration, is incompatible with a constitutional republic. The idea, just like it's been for 50 years, is to strip more power away from Congress and from the courts, consolidate it within the White House, and then use this power to do as much policy work as possible from within the executive branch to promote the conservative agenda.
Well, when the president does it, that means that it is not illegal. By definition, exactly.
In 1649, King Charles I was executed after losing the English Civil War to the supporters of Parliament. He was found guilty on the charge of treason for exercising an unlimited and tyrannical power to rule according to his will and for overthrowing the rights and liberties of the people. Today, a copy of his death warrant hangs in the robing room of the House of Lords. British monarchs, while they're in the robing room to this day, preparing to deliver the state opening of Parliament, are forced to see a copy of that death warrant to contemplate it. The British monarchs and the British people, for as long as that death warrant hangs in that room, will be reminded that there are consequences for abusing executive power. In the United States, in only a marginally less prestigious location, the website of the Presidential Museum of President Gerald R. Ford, you can find the text of Proclamation 4311, otherwise known as the Pardon of Richard Nixon.
Well, when the president does it, that means that it is not illegal.
By definition.
Exactly. Exactly. If the president...
Signed on September 8th, 1974, just over 50 years ago, President Ford pardoned former President Nixon for all crimes he committed or may have committed while president officially, because a trial of Nixon would have damaged a feeling of tranquility in the nation, and because it would expose to further punishment and degradation a man who already paid the unprecedented penalty of relinquishing the highest elective office in the United States. The decision to pardon Richard Nixon was awful, not just because it was a denial of justice to the American people. It was awful because of the precedent that it set. The pardon of Richard Nixon tells us that punishing the president is fundamentally immoral. It tells us that it is morally correct to sacrifice justice to some nebulous conception of tranquility and the public image and ego of the most powerful man in the world. It tells future presidents that you can be flagrantly criminal and face no consequences. It, I think, at least in our minds, places the president above the law. When we think of the crimes of Richard Nixon, we think of Watergate, the plumbers, and the committee to re-elect the president, and I think that's fair. That scandal is ultimately what brought down his presidency. However, I think this is a little bit like remembering Al Capone for his tax fraud, because that's what he was finally convicted of, rather than for being a vicious gangster. Richard Nixon, acting in concert with his own crew of vicious gangsters, is also guilty of secretly and illegally working to sabotage President Johnson's Vietnam peace talks on the eve of the 1968 election, dropping 2.7 million tons of bombs on Cambodia without authorization from Congress, and then lying about it to Congress and the American people, and ordering the CIA to clear the way for a coup d'etat in Chile. This may be the first you're hearing about any of these things, but I promise you, professional politicians, government officials, and all the presidents since Nixon have been very familiar with them all. The presidency has been growing in its power and influence since at least FDR, but Nixon's rampant criminality and the subsequent inability of the American political and judicial systems to hold him officially accountable for anything, even as the crimes themselves were proven, marked the beginning of a new era for the office of the president. Rousseau said that the most important law isn't carved in marble or brass, but in the hearts of the citizens. It forms the true constitution of the state, takes on new powers every day, reinvigorates or supplants other laws when these grow old or die away, maintains in a people the spirit with which it was established, and imperceptibly substitutes the force of habit for the power of authority. Ford's official justification that preserving public tranquility and the feelings of President Nixon was more important than seeking justice only served to make it more difficult to hold future American presidents accountable for their crimes by cementing in the American mind new boundaries for what a president could get away with without being punished. Nixon's pardon was in effect a massive expansion of executive power. I think in my ideal world, the one where Nixon goes to jail, we'd take some inspiration from the British, Charles I, and Parliament. And before every State of the Union address, we'd make the president stand outside the House of Representatives and look at Nixon's articles of impeachment for a while. Maybe this would remind the president and the people that there are consequences for abusing executive power. Unfortunately, though, that's not what happened, and this is not the end of the story.
60 on page 153.
In 2001, the American people wanted a strong leader, and what they had was George W. Bush.
I know the human being and fish can coexist peacefully.
President Bush and Vice President Cheney might not have gone into their first term fully intending to massively expand executive power, but they certainly seized the opportunity when it presented itself. The expansion of presidential power during the Bush administration was unprecedented. A lot of this was because Congress was willing to give the Bush administration basically whatever he asked for after 9/11. Warrantless surveillance, secretive military courts, incredibly broad authorizations for the use of military force, Afghanistan, Iraq, you name it. Congress was willing to do it. But even the incredible power that Congress freely handed over wasn't enough for the Bush administration. So they turned to the conservative wing of the legal profession, which was happy to provide an alternative solution. I think it's important to understand that in the post-President Johnson era, supporting a more powerful president, a more powerful executive, has primarily been a goal of the conservative legal movement. I think this might be confusing for some people to hear, or maybe even irritating for some people to hear, since the idea of strong-armed Democrats like FDR and Johnson still loom fairly large in the American imagination. And Democrats are still the targets of various big government-type political euphemisms. But as the old New Deal coalition really began to fall apart during the Nixon era, the party's relationship to executive power also began to change. Conservatives during the Nixon era had a big problem. They'd never really stopped opposing the administrative agencies created during the period of time between Presidents Roosevelt and Johnson. One part of the Republican coalition at the time viewed them as unaccountable dens of bureaucrats, and another part just didn't like that regulation costs money. They wanted agencies with regulatory authority gone as much as possible, but they were unable to gather enough support in Congress to actually shut them down or even to significantly weaken them. The solution, which came from the conservative legal movement, was Unitary Executive Theory. Unitary Executive Theory is a legal theory first expressed during the Reagan administration, which claims that the Constitution grants the president sole authority over the executive branch of government. It is, in practice, an incredible expansion of executive power because, in its strongest form, Unitary Executive Theory holds that a huge number of the traditional checks and balances that the judiciary and Congress have exercised over the executive branch of government are actually illegitimate. The idea is that it would also allow presidents a lot more authority to shape national policy in these administrative agencies from within the White House, which, for Republicans at the time, was going to mean gutting them, regardless of what Congress or the courts had to say. Which finally brings us back to the Bush administration, which really brought the reality of Unitary Executive Theory into the media spotlight when they utilized it to justify why they were allowed to tell the CIA and the Department of Defense to torture prisoners, even if Congress and the courts said otherwise. You've probably seen the photos of torture during the Bush administration, which I obviously can't show here, but I'd encourage you to look them up later. It's worth seeing the very real consequences of apparently very boring legal memos. Armies of morally bankrupt lawyers made their careers justifying these crimes, providing legal frameworks for them, giving the president the power to do whatever they want, so long as they put up a pretense of operating within the executive branch. The story of the Bush administration and executive power is being given a blank check and then robbing the bank anyway. Congress was willing to follow Bush to almost whatever end, but it was never enough. It was never enough. It wasn't enough to detain people without cause. They had to be tortured. It wasn't enough to invade Afghanistan. We had to lie about weapons of mass destruction to generate enough support for invading Iraq too. The Unitary Executive Theory was crafted by conservative legal theorists who imagined that the president could utilize executive power to force-feed conservative policy to the American public. This kind of greed for power, this straightforward abuse of the law that enabled it during the Bush administration, is incompatible with a constitutional republic. A theory of executive power that allows the president to avoid oversight from Congress and from the courts concentrates far too much power in the hands of one person. If there was ever any symbol of how untouchable the executive branch had become, it was whenever that poor lawyer apologized to Dick Cheney, a man who was probably as critical to the Bush administration as anyone else, for getting shot by Dick Cheney. Again, we accepted a further concentration of power into the hands of the president. Again, we accepted that the executive branch cannot be held accountable for obvious lies and criminal activity. And as we've already discussed, these powers don't just go away. They're held by the office of the president.
President Trump is practically and morally responsible for provoking the events of the day. No question about it. The people who stormed this building believed they were acting on the wishes and instructions of their president. And having that belief was a foreseeable consequence of the growing crescendo of false statements, conspiracy theories, and reckless hyperbole, which the defeated president kept shouting into the largest megaphone on planet Earth.
You just know the Mitch McConnell Republicans of the world thought that they were finally through with Trump after January 6th, right? Of course, this was stupid of them, but I think that's ultimately why they didn't try harder to convict him or really go after him at all for any of the insane things that he did to try and steal the 2020 election. I'm not really interested in relitigating all that here because it's ultimately besides the point. If you don't think that President Trump tried to overturn that election, I talk about some of the arguments here. The point is that for a brief period of time, there actually was broad agreement among influential Republicans and influential Democrats that what happened on January 6th was wrong and that Donald Trump was in some way responsible for it.
And when you have those rioters saying that they are doing so in the name of the President of the United States, if you're a criminal, and you should go to jail. You should go to jail. And this was an attempted act of insurrection.
That period of time was incredibly brief, though. Influential Republicans, maybe because they were worried about base backlash, maybe because of audience capture, maybe because they just thought it would hurt the party. Who knows what they were all really thinking at that time, but anyway, eventually all of them came to believe, just like they did with Nixon, that justice just wasn't worth the fight. And so Donald Trump wasn't held accountable. And like Nixon, the rampant criminality eventually fades into the background, and the reality of the situation becomes lost in the churn of day-by-day politics, where winning is more important than being right, and power is more important than the truth. After the ring-kissing ceremony at the RNC, even Trump's staunchest critics in the primary, the ones who hadn't been effectively expelled from the party anyway, got on board. One of the most misunderstood things about the 2024 election was the Heritage Foundation's Project 2025. What got lost in all the, this is Trump's platform and these are all the insane things Trump wants to do, and I had nothing to do with Project 2025, and I haven't even read it actually, is what Project 2025 actually is. For as much as today's popular Republican politicians love to bash neoconservatism, at its core, what Project 2025 is proposing is a massive expansion of executive power in exactly the same tradition as what the conservative movement has been advocating for since Nixon. The entire thing, all of Project 2025, is predicated on an incredibly broad interpretation of the Unitary Executive Theory. The idea, just like it's been for 50 years, is to strip more power away from Congress and from the courts, consolidate it within the White House, and then use this power to do as much policy work as possible from within the executive branch to promote the conservative agenda. And of course, this plan is going to influence the Trump administration. You're just lying to yourself if you don't recognize that. When JD Vance cites philosophers that believe the Enlightenment was a mistake and that we ought to overthrow the entire American system, and when he makes allusions to cycles of authoritarian power at the end of the Roman Republican period, please understand that he's not joking about these things. He really does believe that it is necessary to dramatically increase executive power so that society can be forced to be conservative. So what can actually be done about any of this? I think the first step is to recognize where we've gone wrong. It's just simply true that since Nixon, influential people and institutions affiliated with the conservative movement have been working very hard to increase the power of the president. Democrats should have done more to combat this trend. While Clinton, Obama, and Biden didn't aggressively seize new executive powers because there isn't an entire left-wing intellectual establishment demanding and justifying this, they all had their fair share of scandals while in office and were more than happy to take advantage of executive powers given to them by Republicans. None of them made enough of an issue about it, despite the fact that an overwhelmingly powerful executive is absolutely essential to the Republican agenda. I don't think it's likely that we can count on presidents to unilaterally cede power back to Congress and admit that being held accountable by the law is actually an important and good thing. The incentives are just all wrong. I also think the prospect of being able to wield the powers of the executive for good also deceives Democrats into forgetting that the power itself has been fundamentally created for evil purposes.
Give Democrats
the weapon of the enemy. Let us use it against him.
You cannot wield it. None of us can.
executive power
Answers to
Republicans
alone. It has no other master.
It's also just not necessary for Democrats like it is for Republicans. Setting aside any high-minded political theory, from a purely practical perspective, Democrats just do not stand to gain as much as Republicans do from supporting a powerful executive. I also worry that if this came from a president, it would look dangerously like the president delegating their power away rather than Congress reasserting itself. I also don't think that it can come from the courts alone, since I don't think that the courts can credibly claim to be any sort of representation of the voice of the people, and the Supreme Court is honestly captured by Federalist Society goons for a generation anyway. The Trump administration is uniquely dangerous, if for no other reason than it's going to be staffed with ideologically whacked out freaks like JD Vance. But in terms of how the Trump administration actually plans to function, it's not fundamentally different from how the Republican Party has been functioning since Richard Nixon. I'd go as far to say that this is actually the logical conclusion of what began in the conservative movement with Richard Nixon. The crime, the expansion of executive power to ever greater heights, the idea that the president is beyond accountability. I think we probably had a lot of opportunities to avoid the situation we're in today. If Democrats had recognized and taken seriously the Republican plan for the presidency sooner, we might have avoided this. McConnell and the Republicans growing a spine after January 6 might have avoided this. If Congress didn't trip over itself to hand George W. Bush a crown, we might have avoided this. If President Ford hadn't decided that justice was less important than Nixon's ego, we might have stopped it all before it started. Hi, everyone. This is Ryan. Thanks so much for your time watching this video today. I really appreciate it. Feel free to like, comment, subscribe, share it with all your friends. It would make me very happy. But seriously, thanks so much for watching. Hope to see you next time.